guys a quick little kind of rundown with some background information about land trusts and conservation easements and land trusts in the state of Texas and around the country, and some of the tools that we use to protect land. And then we're going to do some Q&A with our illustrious panel over here. So if you guys have questions at any time, feel free to raise your hands and I'll answer them as we go, as opposed to waiting to the end. So I always like to start talking about land trusts by talking about why it's so important in Texas that we do this. And it's obviously Texas has a lot of privately owned lands. We're like one of only 4 states in the country with 95% of privately held lands. Most states have much more public lands. And so in Texas, this is really incredibly important if we're going to really protect our natural cultural heritage, our wildlife habitat, as our previous speaker was talking about. And so working in partnership with some of you in the room here, private landowners, is essential. And we have some good incentives, financial incentives, to help make this a little more doable. So Texas is an increasingly urban state, and we have a lot of people, and as she was saying, we're going to get a lot more. We have right now, a lot. We have 131 million acres and still 142 million acres of open lands. A lot of those are working lands. So we have, still a lot to work with in Texas overall. And so Land Trust's job is really to find those interested landowners who are interested in possibly conserving their lands and try to work with them to make that happen. A land trust is really just a nonprofit organization whose mission is to conserve land, or that's at least a big part of their mission. They do a lot of other things like educational programming or different stewardship activities, restoration activities, but conserving land is a big part of what they do. Land trusts have been around in the United States for over 120 years, but most of the growth in this industry has been in the last 20 or 30 years or so. Okay, so my organization is the Texas Land Trust Council, so we're actually an association of all the land trusts in the state. So we work with all of them to try to further their goals. We also help landowners, so if you were interested in trying to find the right land trust to possibly work with, you could contact us and we could try to look through what some of your best options might be and help steer you in the right direction. We also put on a big conference in Austin on the 1st of March that has a lot more information if you're interested in delving deeper into these issues. The Texas perspective on land trusts, so we have about 31 members right now, so there's about 30, 35 or so land trusts that do work or have done work in the state of Texas. They're varied and very diverse in terms of the types of organizations they are. We have engaged about 34,000 citizens in Texas into our work, and hopefully we'll be able to engage a lot more in the coming years. But in Texas, as you can see, kind of the number of land trusts operating in the state really sort of started to take off in the 80s and has pretty much leveled out since 2000s. So again, there's all kinds of different land trusts, and some of them are here on this panel. We'll hear from them, but they can be all volunteer groups. They can have 10 staff people. They all are governed by a volunteer board of directors. So each organization is different in terms of their mission and what they want to conserve and how they do that conservation. But together, we're all working to conserve important land and water resources in the state. So this is just kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of the diversity of organizations that belong to the council. Again, different organizations. We have the Bayou Land Conservancy, which is a rural kind of watershed or sort of an area of Houston, but along a specific greenway focus, but other, kind of a regional area and a local land trust. And then we have Galveston Bay Foundation, which is a kind of larger region. We'll have statewide organizations like the Texas Agricultural Land Trust that do work across the state, but they focus solely on productive agricultural lands. So Native Prairies Association of Texas is also a statewide group, and they focus on simply only prairie ecosystems. So different groups do different things. Nationally, there's about 1,300 land trusts across the United States, and together we have protected over 56 million acres of land, which is quite a lot. Conservation easements represent about 16.7 million acres of that. And the land trusts have also developed some pretty, I think significant forms of governance, and we have a set of standards and practices that the industry has developed to guide land trusts in their work, to make sure that we're doing this work very diligently, and monitoring our easements and enforcing our easements and keeping good records, because land trusts are very unique in the nonprofit community in that we do have a perpetual mission of preserving the lands and easements that we hold forever. And so in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're being effectively governed and managed. And so we have a set of standards and practices that kind of outline how we should all be doing that. And then we have a system of accreditation that land trusts go through to get accredited, essentially certifies that they are doing things in that way. And there's about 350 accredited land trusts of the 1,300. And so we have 11 of our 30 or so land trusts in Texas that are accredited as well. So conservation easements. Conservation easements are essentially just a voluntary agreement between a property owner and a land trust or an easement holder to protect some recognized conservation values in the land. Typically, the conservation easement, what it's essentially doing is restricting some portion of the development rights in perpetuity, and also potentially providing for other protections for the habitat or ways to, things that may be precluded or allowed depending on what the goals of the landowner are, and frankly also what the goals of the land trust are for their conservation mission. So it's a partnership there. Benefits, to this are that we are keeping the land in private ownership, private management. They're very cost effective. So the land trust only comes out, once a year or so, kind of checks everything out, works with their landowner, makes sure things are operating smoothly. But the landowner is still retaining their ownership and management. So in Texas, we had in 1983, the legislature passed our enabling legislation to allow conservation easements essentially to be legal and enforceable here in the state. So hence the proliferation of land trusts in the 80s. Again, I just talked a little bit about this, but what the land trust role is essentially to work with the landowner to negotiate the terms of the easement, and document all those conservation features on the property, and then also work once the easement is recorded with the landowners and with future landowners. So this is binding in perpetuity, so future land trust staff and future owners of that land have to work together to maintain the terms of the easement and make sure that the conservation values are being upheld. And the land trust further has a role to enforce the terms of the easement. If and when there is ever a violation from a landowner, future landowner, or neighbor. So these are the types of jobs that the land trust holds. And we'll let our land trust talk a little bit more about those in a minute. I wanted to give you just a couple of snapshots, some of the incentives that are available at the federal and state level to do these types of agreements. So we have a federal income tax deduction. It is a enhanced income tax deduction for conservation easements specifically. It was made permanent in 2015. So this is something that we have had kind of off and on since 2006. The Land Trust Committee lobbied very extensively over that decade and finally got it made permanent in 2015. And now tax reform is coming, so we're going to have to revisit that all again. But the bottom line here is that it basically, from a normal charitable deduction, it allows you to deduct up to 50% of your gross adjusted income, as opposed to 30%. And if you're a qualified farmer or rancher, you can actually deduct up to 100% of your AGI over a period of essentially 16 years. You get 1 year plus 15 carry forward. So you can really make use of that deduction, especially if you're a qualified farmer or rancher. Also, estate tax reduction is a huge, it's a big help. It's an incentive. You can place an easement on your land. If it's worth a lot for development and you put an easement on it, you're going to reduce the market value. And so when you pass that land on to your heirs, it significantly reduces and sometimes can eliminate the estate tax. The federal Farm Bill also has the largest source of conservation funding in the United States, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. The Farm Bill conservation title has had about $500 million a year for the past 4 or 5 years, and we're about to renegotiate another Farm Bill. So this is a really important source of funding. Texas gets millions of dollars from this fund just for our state each year, and those can be used to purchase conservation easements. They provide about 50% right now, and then you have to find another 25% of a local match, and then the landowner could donate up to 25% of the value. So this is a great funding source that is eligible across the state. And now, back in 2015, we actually got our first appropriation into the Texas Farm and Ranch Land Conservation Program, which is our statewide program to fund conservation easement purchase. And this pot can essentially serve as that 25% local match to do these projects, 25 or 50 depending. But this is a huge, very exciting thing for us who work in this field, because it actually will allow us to potentially do more conservation easement work because we now have this matching source. So the first $2 million that went into this program funded about 7 projects. Over 10,000 acres were conserved, and the value of the $2 million that went in was $16 million of conservation easement value. So for the state's $2 million, they got back $16 million in conservation easement value. Plus they got another 11 or $12 million in terms of water resources that are captured annually by those lands. So we've done some work in coordination with the Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute to look at these benefits, and we're going to continue to do that so that we can show how important this program is for Texas. All right, so this is just to give you a few visuals about what land trusts have done. This is 1.64 million acres. You can see how the blue is fee simple conservation, red is conservation easement, so you can see that really tick up later in the 2000s, and then green is just cumulative total. So just to give you a sense of how this work has taken off. This is our conservation lands inventory map. This is one of the things the Land Trust Council maintains. It's a statewide database of all the lands that land trusts have helped to conserve. So you can see along the coast, there's been a lot of activity, also in the Texas Hill Country, a couple of hot spots out in West Texas. But this is just to give you guys a sense of where this work is happening. All this stuff is on our website. We have lots of other things on our website, landowner resource guides, land trust directory. So I'd encourage anyone who's interested in learning more to go there. And I'm happy to answer questions from you. And then I have questions for my panel up here. So are there any questions so far? Okay, great. All right, well, so these questions are just basically going to be kind of open, and you guys can each go through and answer them. But if you would just start off by describing the focus of your particular land trust work, where you're working, why, and how you kind of identify your conservation priorities. And I guess you're going to have this now.
All right. Hi. Well, I'm Becky Martinez with Bayou Land Conservancy, and as our name implies, our focus is on conserving land adjacent to streams, and so we conserve that land. It's kind of a threefold purpose: for flood mitigation, just giving water a place to go, for clean water, improving water quality, and then also for wildlife. And our focus area is really, it's the watersheds that feed into Lake Houston. So we're talking about northern Harris County, Montgomery County, a little bit of Liberty, so up in the northern area of where we are right now. That's a quick snapshot of us.
I'm Matt Singer. I'm with the Galveston Bay Foundation, and our main focus is to preserve and protect the natural resources around Galveston Bay. So understandably, we're really focused on water quality for the users of Galveston Bay, and our land conservation program focuses on buying and protecting lands adjacent to the bay itself, tributaries of the bay, and all other natural habitats within that the lower Galveston Bay watershed.
And I'm Wesley Newman with Katy Prairie Conservancy, and as our name implies, we are focused on the Katy Prairie, West Central Harris County, Central Waller County out to the Brazos River. We are a landowner as well as an easement holder.
All right, so if you guys could talk a little bit more about the land trust role in sort of negotiating the easement and talk about that process and what that looks like a little bit.
Keep going in this order.
Sure.
All right. So what's our role in negotiating the conservation easement? We are there, we are trying to be a partner with our landowners. We work to understand their goals and try to fit them, try to see how that fits with our goals of land preservation. We're pretty unique at Bayou Land Conservancy, where I would say about 75%, give or take, of the properties that we have under conservation easement are related to Clean Water Act, wetlands, and stream mitigation. So a lot of our landowners that, they're different landowners, but they come to us really with a permitting need. So that makes it a little bit more unique. But we talk with every landowner and try and figure out what they're trying to do and how we can achieve that together.
Right, and as Becky mentioned, there's different forms of or different reasons to put a conservation easement on a property. One of those is mitigation. One of those is to preserve a family property. Sometimes it's to generate revenue for a family who's land rich and cash poor, to draw some of that value out of the property. Not every family is in a position to donate their property to a land trust or donate a conservation easement to a land trust. So funding for that is one of our roles. In terms of negotiating the conservation easement, we want to make sure that our priorities for preservation are going to be preserved in perpetuity. So whether it's a property that's going to be used for agricultural purposes in the future, or simple preservation of natural resources or a native habitat, specific habitat, we want to make sure that those types of protections are built into the conservation easement, that they can be enforced in the future, and as well at the same time meeting the needs of the landowner themselves.
Okay, well, I don't have a whole lot to add to all of that. I would say that the Katy Prairie Conservancy is somewhat unique in being a landowner. We have third parties hold easements on some of our properties, and being a land trust, we hold easements on other people's properties. So we've kind of been on both sides of these negotiations, where we're trying to figure out what the landowner's wants and needs are, and if they meet our wants and needs. And the flip side is we're negotiating with another land trust to hold an easement on our properties. It's that same negotiation, just from a different direction. So I think it gives us an interesting perspective, having been on both sides of that.
You want to start this time so you get a fair crack at it? Okay.
Okay, so my next question is just, I'm sure y'all can probably hear me, but just what, so what happens, after the easement is signed? What does stewardship look like? What does that mean? How do you do that?
Okay, our stewardship monitoring is typically once a year. I think all of our easements require that we have access to the property once a year. And if we've done the negotiations properly, typically it's the monitoring is pretty much go out, visit with the people, see the property, and document what you've seen, and go home and write a little report saying everything looks good. There are sometimes issues that arise where inadvertently, or neighbors' encroachments, things like that you have to deal with. But we've been fortunate with our easement so far. We've had very few problems, and it's about maintaining relationships with these landowners. We try to talk to our landowners at least once. Well, try to talk to them more than once a year. Most of them I do. And so if you maintain those lines of communication, you minimize the potential for easement violations down the road.
All right, as Wes mentioned, we're obligated to go out at a minimum once a year to take a look at our conservation easement properties and ensure that none of our conservation values have been compromised, none of the details of the conservation easement have been encroached upon or violated. At least once a year we're going out to these properties. In some situations though, we take a more active role in our conservation easement stewardship, where we organize volunteer events to come out and do invasive species control or other habitat maintenance activities that the landowner may or not be able to accomplish on their own. And this also gives us a chance to meet with the landowner and promote conservation, good quality conservation and habitat management on their properties. It just gives us an opportunity to push them in the right direction and develop that relationship a little bit better.
Well, darn, as the third person, they really covered most of that. Really covered the question there. I was just going to add, as far as the stewardship, and if there are issues or problems on a property, what we like to do is we like to work with the landowner and try and solve those problems. So if they're having issues with trespassing or with ATV usage coming on properties, which is really common for us, we like to work with the landowners and try and figure out, how can we slow this down or prevent it, but slow it down at least. So we like to, really, as they were both saying, build these good relationships that keep going for years, because it is in perpetuity. And we're not going to be here, the landowners won't be there, but if we've built a good relationship, it'll make it a lot easier to go forward. I was going to add one thing on the reasons why people get conservation easements. And I don't know if you two have heard this yet, but people, want to do conservation easements for all different types of reasons. But one of the funniest ones I've heard was I was at a meeting and they wanted one, it was a private landowner, out of spite. He did not want his children to build on this land that he had for decades. And so he told us he wanted it out of spite. And we were happy to oblige.
Well, there you go. Okay, so I don't know if anyone else out there has a question they want to ask to our panel. Yeah, go ahead.
Based on the program, the conservation easement program, what is the minimum acreage to be considered?
Okay, the question is there a minimum acreage to be considered? So that's kind of dependent on the trust, so I'll let y'all.
Yeah. For Bayou Land Conservancy, usually 5 acres is our smallest that will go, just because the amount of time and effort going into stewardship of the property. But that said, if it's a property that's adjacent to another one of our preserves, that's a factor that we consider.
Right, and at Galveston Bay Foundation, we have about a 20-acre minimum that we try to reach before agreeing to do a conservation easement. But there's also circumstances that would allow us to consider something much smaller, whether it had a really specific conservation feature on the property that we wanted to protect, whether that's a specific habitat for an animal or water quality benefit, or continuity with our existing preserved lands.
Ditto. Basically, we just look at location, any unique special features that would be important to us, and then we would, obviously, in the dialogue of what the landowner wants to do, would play a role in that as well. And so it's just a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and what can add to that is that all 3 of our organizations are accredited land trusts, and that has kind of forced us to develop specific criteria on how we select our projects. And so each of us will likely have a project selection criteria that we might be able to provide to you to see if your property might fit into our goals and our priorities.
So yeah, I want to talk a little about that, like how you have a committee probably and a process and your criteria, and just a little bit about how that works, so they can kind of get a sense.
Yeah, so what we do is generally we'll start off talking with the landowner, get a feel for the property, and then at BLC we have a lands committee, and so we will sit and we will talk about the property and consider it, consider going on a site visit. Usually we'll do a site visit before we do our checklist, our site criteria checklist, so that helps us fill it out. But yeah, it's a process, but it's a very workable one and a very flexible process.
Right, and ours is it's pretty simple. It has to be within the Galveston Bay watershed, so geography plays a role in it. And it has to have we have to have the capacity internally, both financially and with our staff, to conserve and steward the property long term. And then it has to have a public benefit. We have to be able to identify how this benefits the public of our region.
Once again, pretty much the same. If we're approached and someone has an interest, we'll typically start with me looking at the property if I don't already know where it is, and then if I determine that it's something that we could be interested in, then we would go through the formal process, start checking off things off the checklist, present it to our stewardship committee, and then on up to the board and decide if we can execute the project.
Anybody else have any questions? Oh, all right. Good. Go ahead.
The perspective of a public agency landowner with conservation easements, how do you balance the goals of potentially wanting to create public access to these lands versus obviously the fundamental goal of protecting the natural resource values of the land too?
Well, I'll take a stab at that first. I mean, typically, conservation easements in and of themselves don't require public access, period. So only if that's a goal of the landowner or potentially of the land trust and the landowner is amenable would that be even discussed. But there are circumstances where certain landowners do want that. There's a big project in Central Texas where the landowner actually wanted a section of the property to be, create trails and have a little place for public access. Other places it might just be a little connector piece of a trail. There are a lot of land trusts that do that work. So, but I'll let y'all, does anybody have anything to add to that?
I can add a little bit to that. So, Bayou Land Conservancy, we hold conservation easements along the Spring Creek Greenway, and that's been a really wonderful project for us. We, as you were saying, Lori, it all depends on what the landowner wants, and we try to work with them, but we also try to find a balance between, those portions of the land that have, in our case with the Greenway, that have trails on them, versus the rest of the land that's preserved and doesn't have anything on it. But for us, we really love those public access projects and those properties because it gets people outside. And if we can get people outside and they're on the property and they're appreciating this one property, they're going to have a greater appreciation for other open, wild places. Or at least that's our thinking behind it.
Yeah. This topic really helps show the diversity and the flexibility of a conservation easement and the tool that it can be used for. We've got an example of a project that we've done in Chambers County where we've worked with a local entity to conserve a very pristine piece of property for water quality purposes. The entity did not really want to manage the land or be in charge of the public access, so we signed an agreement as the land trust to not only hold the conservation easement over the property, but steward the property for wildlife habitat and manage the property for public access. So that included developing trail systems, interpretive signs, viewing platforms, parking, and kayak launches. So we were able to work with the public entity to develop a conservation easement that allowed all those uses of the lands, that it was all compatible with the conservation values, as well as allowing that public access to bring ecotourism to the area, help generate economic growth in the area within that industry, and it's been a really positive project for us. So we've done that on a number of occasions, but that's one that came to mind first and foremost. Anything else?
Well, the only thing I want to add to that is that this again shows the importance of the relationship between the land trust and the landowner and finding the right fit, because not all land trusts may be interested in dealing with public access. And so when you're looking for a land trust to hold an easement, it should be like any other job interview. Are our interests mutually aligned so that we don't end up at a stalemate 3/4 of the way through the process because we can't agree to what you want? And so just again emphasizing the importance of finding the right land trust that you can have a good relationship with.
And also from a public entity perspective, staff and priorities of those entities are going to change over time. So having a conservation easement over a piece of property helps maintain the original intent of those tax dollars going to preserve a piece of property for a specific purpose. So I think it's a good partnership to make with a land trust to help protect that original intent of taxpayer dollars for a public access or green infrastructure or whatever it is.
Talk a little bit about things that are typically negotiated in, allowed, not allowed, what, on an easement. And if anyone has any specific question about something being allowed or not allowed, yeah.
Duration of time for this easement, is it?
It's
long?
forever,
Forever.
yes. So once these, at least all of the ones that these organizations engage in, and most of the land trusts, all the land trusts that we work with in Texas, the duration is forever, it's perpetual. So it ties with the deed, runs with the deed, and binds all future landowners to the same conditions.
Yeah, two questions. Number one, typically, I realize every situation is different, but landowner comes to you today and says, I want to put my land in an easement. What's the typical timeline? Are we talking 3 months, 3 years before that deal is finished? And then second,
Could be either.
okay, just to go through the general rule, typically.
I don't know, what's the general rule?
But second, most of us don't, or a lot of people don't own the mineral rights. So we put our land in a conservation easement. Are there negative tax implications if later on a mineral company wants to come and negatively impact the ecological value of that land by extracting the mineral from the land?
Okay. Anybody want to tackle the mineral rights issues?
I'll start on
Okay.
it a little bit. Mineral rights are a complicated issue because, we're sitting on top of the Katy Exxon gas field, and we have property that, are operating under leases that were written in the 1930s. What we've tried to do where we can, we try to designate drill sites if possible, or we try to specify in our easement language that if exploration comes about, that we want to be a party at the table to have input onto where and how it's done, because ultimately, the people with the mineral rights have kind of pretty much free reign, and you just kind of have to hold their feet to the fire and make sure, we had a company come on to us and wanting to drill right square in the middle of a wetland project we had just built. And they came out and looked at it and said, well, this is where it needs to be. I said, well, when that fills up with water, you're going to be under 4 feet of water. Oh, no, that's not a wetland. And so we went round and round, and sure enough, they hired someone. They came out and said, oh, yeah, that is a wetland. Maybe we better move. And so, again, the way we would, I think, structure it is that if we can't designate drill sites, then we would want to be a party at the table when those negotiations were going in play about where and how things are done.
Yeah, as Wes mentioned, the mineral issue is very complicated. Few of our landowners actually own all or even some of the mineral rights below their land. So what we try to do is limit the potential impacts of future exploration or production of oil and gas. And we do that by designating drill sites or trying to encourage directional drilling. Technology in oil and gas production is getting better, so they can access the minerals underneath your property from sites that are not within your conservation easement. But if that's not the case, then we try to protect ourselves from impacting special places on the property, specific habitat types, and do our due diligence up front to make sure that we know where these drill sites could be the best place on the property to access those subsurface minerals. No, tax status is a wow. That might be something that an attorney could answer quickly.
What do you mean tax status? Which tax status?
So what I'm referencing is, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Like if you got a tax deduction, would it then
the landowner gets a
retroactively?
benefit because of the ecological lift of the project, right? But now you could make an argument that let's get away from oil and gas. Let's say we're up in East Texas and it's a
Surface mining is the one thing that is strictly prohibited with
Okay.
conservation easements typically, certainly in order to get a federal tax deduction.
Okay,
There's
well,
absolutely no surface mining.
Well, regardless, let's say they put in, 100 wells on your property, and you could make the argument that the ecological function is not as good as it was before. So is there any tax implication on the landowner at that point, is my question.
Well, so 100 wells on your property. I mean,
Lori?
yeah, Marianne, you want to answer that?
Tom Kelsey and Burgess Jackson are both gonna be doing panels.
Okay.
Burgess is gonna
Getting
talk
more into the
about it
weeds on
because
this.
We've been looking at pipeline issues
Okay.
and oil and gas. So
Okay.
that question, if you-
Yeah, you're asking good and complicated questions that attorneys are better to answer.
Oh,
So.
we didn't address his timeline.
Oh yeah, the timeline question really, I mean, in all seriousness, it varies. I mean, yeah, could you negotiate a conservation in 4 or 6 months? Maybe if everybody's totally copacetic and everything's good and it's, no issues, one landowner, one land trust. If the landowner is like a family of 12 and some of them hate each other, then that is very complicated and usually takes a very long time to get everyone on the same page. So, it could be, and then like you said, issues arise or mineral rights are not owned by the landowner, then that's a little complication. Things have to be worked out or, so there's other things that you can do to kind of move them along. But I would say maybe a year would be a good average, more or less. All right, any other questions? Yeah, Marianne?
Lori, can you have, well, first of all, ours is generally a year. The closer you get to the end of the year, it's likely that we have a lot of deals working, so it's hard to do. But can we ask the panel if any of them have had any experience with second generation landowners where either the land has been sold or you've got new family members who may not have been the ones who actually placed the easement on the land? And how you've dealt with.
Do you have any of those? Any of you?
No.
Yeah, not yet. This is, so in Texas, being that, most of these organizations have gotten rolling in the, 70s and 80s more so, and most of these easements, haven't even started happening until, the 80s. In general, there's not a lot of turnover yet in our state. In other parts of the country where they've been going on for, 100 plus years, there are, second generation landowners. And a lot of times that goes just fine, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think, one of the things the land trust community is really trying to figure out is how we can ensure that when the property changes hands, the land trust gets notified so that we can then make sure that we are educating the new landowners about the easement and what it means and how we can work with them. So a lot of land trusts are putting those things into their easements so that they make sure to get notification when the property changes hands. Try to help with that. Yeah.
What sort of development typically is allowed under conservation easements?
So what kinds of things? So y'all want to kind of tackle, typically depends on how large the property is, but a subdivision of a larger parcel or two, a couple of reserved home sites, or certainly ag production facilities that are needed. What else?
I was just going to add trails, but really we kind of talked about that earlier. Some passive recreation is some of the things that we allow.
Right, yeah, things that have temporary or localized impacts that are not long-standing, like putting up a duck line or something like that, would be definitely allowed. Trail systems, piers, and that kind of stuff for recreational activities certainly be allowed. As Lori mentioned, any agricultural related infrastructure, fences and barns would definitely something we would try to address in our language in the conservation easement, but something that's definitely negotiable when we're talking about the long-term land use of the property. Anything else?
Have anything to add to that?
What about hunting?
Yes.
Hunting is something that we typically do not limit. We typically don't want to try to enforce a no hunting clause on the property, so we specifically typically will allow hunting to be allowed on our properties.
Yeah, I mean, and the questions, I mean, I know of one land trust that doesn't do an easement that allows hunting. They don't do easements that allow hunting. That's not in this area, but so there are groups that's something they won't do. It really is. That's why each land trust is different and unique. And if you want to do one of these agreements, you should meet with, a couple of different ones to see which ones are, you know, aligned with what you want to do on the property. You want to make sure that hunting can be allowed, and that's one of the main, you know, uses you want to ensure. That's totally fine with a lot of these groups, with the vast majority. But that's why it's important to talk to the right, you know, make the right match. Yeah.
One thing that we also look at is the commercial activity. So we don't allow commercial feedlots, things like that. We don't really allow shooting ranges other than usually for private use. So we try to actually maintain the conservation values of all these things. And it really, again, as each of the panelists has said, depends on what you're trying to get out of the property and keep as conservation values and what we're trying. But ultimately, the IRS will look at it as well. Because if you've stripped all of those values away and just left the minimum one, you're not going to get much of a tax deduction. And I think Tom and Jeff Burgess are going to talk about that too.
And certainly what's allowed and not allowed to, it depends if you're donating the easement or if you're getting if it's getting purchased from you from any one of these, you know, programs, the Farm Bill programs, the Farm Arrangement program. They may have certain things that they want to allow or not allow. And if you want to get paid the hundreds of thousands of, you know, dollars, you'll need to agree to that. And so different, you know, again, different funding pots, different, you know, all of them are unique, truly.
I'll say one more thing. Most of our conservation easements have, one of our main purposes is to provide wildlife habitat and increase wildlife species populations. So we want to see good stewardship from the landowner long term, so we might try to limit the hunting to take out any kind of like day use hunting, or lining up 60 dove hunters to pump a bunch of lead into your rice field is probably not the best use of that property, because you're going to have waterfowl in those same rice fields next year. So trying to limit it might be one of our clauses we put in the conservation easement, but definitely not excluding it altogether.
Oh, let me just, and again, this all goes back to finding the right fit. You know, because easements can be very different. We have an easement that was funded through USDA Farmland Protection Program, and that easement looks very different from an easement we have next door that is protecting kind of riparian bottomland hardwoods. You know, the ground that's protected by the Farmland Protection Program is pasture, but if he decides he wants to start growing rice again, he can go in there and plow it up and start growing rice, because that's what it's about. But if the one next door decided he wanted to start growing rice, went in and bulldozed a bunch of trees to start growing rice, then that becomes an issue. So again, it's finding the fit, making sure goals and objectives are aligned so that everyone's on the same page when the thing gets signed.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
What about property that is owned by a non-for-profit corporation? You know, we have 750 acres in East Texas. It's not around bayous or water or anything like that. So there are some land conservation trusts that address that for non-profit corporations.
Well, I mean, a land trust can hold an easement that nonprofit is the landowner at that point. And so they can work with a nonprofit that's the landowner, or, you know, a family or an individual, or, you know, so it could work the same way depending on what the property is, what's on it, what the conservation values are. And if that nonprofit wants to place a conservation easement on, you know, the vast majority of that land, then it needs to go out and find a partner, a land trust partner that would like to do that as well and start the process. But yeah, I mean, a nonprofit will work basically the same way. You obviously, if you donated it, you wouldn't really be able to reap the tax deductions. But all right, any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, one more question.
Yeah.
From a regional perspective, and this is great that we've got the 3 land trusts up there that represent probably 2/3 of this region.
Right.
What role do you guys see for y'all's 3 land trusts playing in concert to increase resiliency in this region from a post-Hurricane Harvey type standpoint? I thought it would be an appropriate thing to ask.
Yes, so how can land trust help make our communities more resilient?
Specifically these three.
Specifically these three. And if you're interested in delving into that topic in more detail, please come to the conference that we're hosting in Austin in March, because we're going to be having a featured session on this topic as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I almost think it was planted, but because the three of us, that is a major focus for us. In my case with Bayou Land Conservancy, so we're preserving really the lands we end up preserving are floodplains, because we're interested in those flooding areas right next to the bayou, streams, and creeks. And how we see our role with flood mitigation is by preserving that land, we're just giving water a place to go. And it's just that simple. It's just a place to go that's not a house, it's not a business. It's just somewhere to go.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, because resiliency means something different to each person. So in our case, for Galveston Bay Foundation, resiliency means a lot of different things. There's local economies, fisheries is a big component of that, and access to the water. But also, we do a lot of a really active restoration program where we're recreating marshes, doing shoreline stabilization work, like living shorelines to reduce erosion during these major storm events, to protect both private properties as well as public interest properties. Oyster reefs and sustainable fisheries is a big component of what we're doing with some of our big federal and state partners, trying to make sure that those industries are going to be around and sustainable for future generations. But resiliency in general could mean a lot of different things, so it's hard to answer that question just based on that fact.
Yeah, I think we're doing a lot of the same thing. I mean, the prairies and the wetlands that are associated with Katy Prairie, the riparian corridors, all these things add resiliency to the natural system. As we're getting development built closer to us, around us, we provide a place for things to go as habitat is taken away through other land uses. And so, alone, KPC is not going to be able to save the world, but what we're doing, we hope with what we have, we know that there will be 14,000 acres of open space out there that we're doing our best to manage, to take care of, for wildlife habitat, for wetlands, for prairies, for the things that the prairie has been known for. And so the more of that we can protect, the more resilient the system is. The more it goes away, the less resilient the system becomes, if we're just talking about it from an ecological perspective. So we're doing what we can to maintain that.
Yeah, so I think all of us will agree on this panel that having open space and green space is going to make our areas more resistant to natural disasters, and that would in turn be making our communities more resilient, mitigating future property loss and loss of life.
All right, any other final questions for this illustrious panel of amazing land trust people? Okay. All right, well then we're going to wrap it up, and I think we take a break now, is that right?